This week we're looking at the ways we can use focal length and depth of field to tell stories with cinematography. Hello, my name is Cade and this is DSLRguide. So lens choice is another key part of filmmaking that cinematographers can use to better tell a story. Now, it's perhaps more subtle than framing and lighting, which we've already done separate videos about, link in the description, but it's definitely taken me a few years to even begin to understand the creative use for lenses, because the majority of videos here on YouTube are definitely focusing on the technical side and the practical side. So this week I really want to look at the why rather than the how. So the first thing is depth of field. Now, to really quickly get the technical side out of the way, the idea is that we can change our aperture so the background is more blurry, or we can use a deep depth of field so that everything is in focus. In terms of the creative application for depth of field, I think there are definitely a few things to consider. The first one is that our eyes will never actually see a really shallow depth of field. So if you do use a razor thin depth of field where the background is really out of focus, then I think it is going to give quite a dreamlike, surreal kind of atmosphere, because it is so different to anything that we would ever see naturally with our eyes. But I think the other frame of reference we should look at is cinema, and obviously in cinema they do often use a depth of field that is shallower than our eyes. But I think it's also worth noting the amount of times when they do use deep focus, because it's very common for people who just start out on a DSLR or on any kind of large sensor camera to just kind of go crazy with shallow depth of field. So for example, if you're doing a zombie apocalypse movie about survival, then it might not make sense to have that really dreamy, nice, soft, beautiful bokeh in the background. Whereas if it is a flashback scene or a romance scene, then in terms of conventional cinema, that would make a lot of sense. Now, obviously there are no rules in filmmaking, and everything is just kind of deciding whether you want to be conventional or not. There does seem to be a misconception that shallow depth of field equals cinematic, and I do agree that in most movies they will have some shots that have a shallow depth of field, but I think the reality is now that we've kind of flipped it around so that cinema is actually using a shallow depth of field less than your average DSLR filmmaker. One of my favourite uses of a rack focus is in The Incredibles. Now, on the blog post I'll put a link to this scene so that you can watch it and see what I mean, but it's basically a focus pull that actually links in really nicely with both the character and the plot of the film. So in the scene, Bob, who is a retired superhero working at an insurance firm, is being lectured by his boss, and he looks over to the window. Now, as he looks over, we pull focus from him to what is going on outside. So already we can tell that he is bored by his job and by his current lifestyle. Just like he can't focus on the situation with his boss, the camera can't focus on him, and the camera looks out the window. The audience are distracted just like he is. And what is it that he focuses on instead? There's someone being mugged outside. So in less than 10 seconds, we've already established that 1, he's bored of his lifestyle, and 2, the thing he really would like to be doing is fighting crime and saving people. And if you've seen the film, that you'll know that this is pretty much kind of an overarching theme for the whole film, and it's really nicely set up and kind of summarized just with that simple pull focus shot. So next up is focal length. Now there are 2 things that change when we zoom in or zoom out, and the first thing is compression. So for a little bit of background, on a Super 35 sensor, which is the kind of sensor that is found in the Red cameras, in Arri Alexa, and a lot of other cinema cameras, then using a lens that's around 28 or 35mm will look pretty natural. Martin Scorsese, Orson Welles and Spielberg have all mentioned the 28mm lens as one of their most frequently used ones, and Roger Deakins says that he uses a 32mm lens most often. Now, in terms of storytelling, I think this means that we can kind of set the middle point, the neutral point, to be around 30mm based on that's what's conventional in cinema, and then if we want to go higher or lower, then we can see what the effects are. So what does actually change when we zoom in or zoom out? Well, you can see from this example that a shot at 17mm compared to 100mm will make someone's face look extremely different. And if you haven't learned about the kind of practicalities of why this is, then I did do a video before about compression and how it works a little bit, so I'll put that on the blog post so you can see what I mean. So I think we should treat focal length as a kind of spectrum. So on one end you've got the really wide, something like 17mm, and then on the other end you've got more telephoto, like 200, and then somewhere in the middle is the kind of majority of shots. So for example, in cinema, the majority of the time things are going to be filmed on somewhere between a 24 and an 85 35mm lens, the vast majority, because I think it's that the other lenses on the kind of wider end of the spectrum just have a too much of an extreme look. The Conversation is a great film which is all about surveillance. The main character has to listen into a conversation from a distance. So the shots we see of this conversation use an extreme telephoto lens, and we can see the compression quite clearly even in the trailer, which I'll embed on the blog post. So people often describe the telephoto look as kind of letting the audience feel as if they're watching but from a distance, as if they're not actually in the moment like they are with a wide angle lens, but they are just kind of watching from far away. And this makes a lot of sense if we look into the kind of natural world and see that the only time outside of photography and filmmaking that we would probably see that telephoto look would be through binoculars or a telescope, which are both associated with being far and looking in. Another example of using extreme lenses creatively would be the films of Stanley Kubrick, which a lot of them are very surreal. So the fact that he used a lot of wide-angle lenses definitely kind of helps to kind of set the atmosphere a little bit off, especially when you can see people's faces because they get quite close to the lens and it looks really, really distorted, which I think works very well for his films, which are kind of, on purpose very different from your average kind of style of filmmaking. So for example, in A Clockwork Orange, it works really well during the kind of violent scenes to have these extremely wide angle lenses to kind of show that it's a dystopian world and that, things are very different. So I think, as with all aspects of filmmaking, we can find out what the kind of conventional way of doing things, which in this case is shooting things mostly between 24 and 85mm, but then also to look out for opportunities to be unconventional, especially if it works well for the film or for the scene, which I think in terms of Stanley Kubrick, it works very well. So because of this lens compression, where we take two things in front of the camera and make them seem closer or further away, when we use a wide-angle lens, it makes things seem like they're travelling further, because to get from point A to point B will take the same amount of time, but they'll appear to be travelling a greater distance because everything seems spaced out. So in terms of camera movement and movement within the frame, this really kind of makes a difference. So for example, in a car chase, you might choose to add some energy by using wide-angle lenses, getting them really close to the floor to show that kind of speed. And in a similar way, you could use it creatively using a telephoto lens. Let's say you've got someone who's a hitchhiker and they're out and it's really hot and they're wishing that they could get picked up, and then a car comes over the horizon, but you shoot it with a telephoto lens and then you can see that it's moving, but it doesn't really ever get much closer because of that telephoto lens really squishing the distances. So what you'd get is that the audience can kind of feel the same thing that the character is feeling, where they want that car to arrive. They wish that that car wouldn't be going so agonizingly slowly, but that could really work for the film if that's kind of how the character is feeling. So while you really could make a whole film with a 24 to 70mm lens, I definitely think it's worth understanding what the kind of more extreme sides do, because of course you can always just tone it down by only zooming into 70 or only zooming out to 24 if you don't want it to be too extreme. So next up, I'm just going to really quickly talk about field of view. Now it's pretty self-explanatory. The idea is that if we zoom out, then as well as the compression changing, we also can see more within the frame. But we could also change our field of view by moving the camera. So if we just back up the camera, then in the same way, we'll be able to see more of the scene. So I think this is the important thing to remember, is that let's say we want to get a close-up, there are two things we could do. Number one, we could keep the camera exactly where it is and zoom in, or we could move the camera closer. And I think it's definitely worth choosing your lens and choosing your focal length based on the compression rather than just the field of view, because most of the time you can move the camera closer to change the field of view. So the idea is that, let's say you want to have a wide angle lens look, but you want to get a close-up, rather than just zooming in and introducing some more compression, you could still get the wide angle lens look by maybe using a 24, but getting it really close so that we still get the field of view of a close-up. You don't want to get in the habit of using a lens compression that doesn't work for your scene just because you couldn't be bothered to move the camera. So of course the other part of field of view is the kind of shot that we get. Do we want to have a really wide field of view where we can see everything, or do we want to go for an extreme close-up where their face fills the frame? Now I'm going to make a different video talking about this in a lot more detail, so for now I'll just say that I think the best thing to do is to find a film that you really like, or maybe a couple of different films, and study them. Notice how often they use close-ups and how often they use wide shots, and how many of them are just kind of a neutral medium shot, because there's definitely this idea that if we use close-ups too much, then they kind of get a bit diluted. They don't have that maximum emotional impact. So I definitely think it's worth just kind of, really breaking down a film and noticing what kind of shots they use and how often they use them. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is the kind of aesthetics of a lens. So each lens will have a different way of reproducing colour and contrast, but then you also have things like the sharpness, as well as flaring and vignettes, and all the different kind of technicalities of lenses. Now, on a Hollywood film set, they do choose their lenses very carefully based on whether it's kind of like got a more vintage look, or just, very specifically the colours that it reproduces and the effect that that can have on the atmosphere of the film. But to be honest, I think on my budget, and unless you are doing Hollywood films, this really is pretty insignificant, because the difference is so small, and it costs so much more money for, say, the Cooke primes, which are kind of legendary. So really, I think the most important things are your focal length and your depth of field. And on those movie sets, they will already thought about all of that stuff, and they're just, then going into the details because they do have the budget for that. So my advice is to not worry about chromatic aberration or sharpness, all these different kind of technical things, and really focus on the more important things like focal length and depth of field, which will actually have a direct impression on your audience rather than just really, really subtle differences between lenses. So that's pretty much it for this week. As usual, there's plenty of more information on the blog post. I put a lot of those example scenes that I was talking about on there, as well as some other information. That's it for this week. I'll see you next time.